She got it recovered in more muted flowers. My father stopped by a few times just after the renovations. He and my mother seemed easy with each other, joking and admiring the house, both of them liking the shade of paint inside. The new industrial light fixtures, two white metal bars over a rigid frosted glass shade, fixtures that were meant for outdoors but looked good inside too. When my parents were together, I felt something inside me click into place, like a magnet clasp. A few times during that first year in the house, when it was still new and perfect around us, she would walk in the front door and stop and gasp, putting her hand on her heart at the beauty of a gold parallelogram made of light glowing on the wall above the heat vent. Over the years in that house, my mother told stories about my father and her family when they occurred to her, or I asked about them. She said my father was so shy and awkward in high school that when he would talk or tell a joke, no one would listen. He had made my mother a kite and a pair of sandals. When they lived together that summer at the end of Stevens Canyon Road in the house with the goats, they slept under quilts my mother's grandfather from Ohio had made, and for a treat, they ate those cheap miniature hot dogs out of jars. At some point that summer, my mother said they were down to their last $3 and they drove to the beach, where my father threw the money into the ocean. I was terrified, she said, but then he sold more of the blue boxes and we had money again. The story of my parents is not complete without a picture of my mother's disintegrating family life, of how after the family arrived in California, when she was 12, her mother became mentally ill. Her parents, Jim and Virginia, had moved the family west when my grandfather's employer, the Department of Defense, transferred him from Dayton, Ohio, where she was born and both her grandmothers lived, to Colorado Springs, then to Omaha, Nebraska, and finally to California. In California, Virginia was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and my mother's parents divorced. My mother spoke of Ohio like a lost paradise. In Ohio, her grandmothers had made quilts and doted on her, let her play with the skin on the back of their hands. One of them had a farm and a chicken coop where my mother ran to collect eggs in the morning. The time before her mother went crazy, anytime my mother pointed out some beauty around us that looked established and grand, gold dusk light stretched across brick buildings with pillars, great trees. She named the beauty Ohio. In California, Virginia would sit in the darkened living room, drunk, smoking, the only visible thing, the lit tip of her cigarette, waiting for her daughters to get home from school. My mother was only a little older than I was now. Virginia aimed much of her spite and contempt at her. Maybe because my mother, sensitive, artistic, and bright, reminded her of most of herself. When my mother was 12, Virginia accused her of playing the reporter only because it reminded her of a penis, and Virginia told the neighbors that my mother had sex with dogs. When my mother met my father in high school, what impressed her most were his kind eyes compared with her own mother's eyes, which by then were hateful dark sparks. The third time I visited Steve's house in high school, his mother took me aside. She told me that in his first 6 months, she was afraid she might lose him because his birth mother wanted him back, and she didn't allow herself to get close to him. At this time, I had no idea why she was telling me this. my mother said. I was just a high school student. It wasn't like I thought I'd known him that long. She told the story as if it meant something, but I wasn't sure what it meant. They fell in love. My father wrote long notes to Virginia and left them on her front door, telling Virginia she was cruel, imploring her to stop being cruel to my mother. My father was my mother's savior then, noticing her talent, beauty, and sensitivity, caring for her when her own mother was violent and insane. You're the most creative person I've ever met, he told her. My parents took LSD together. His first time, not hers. The drug took a while to kick in, she said. So you just waited around, and then at some point you realized the world wasn't normal anymore, and the trip had started. The idea of my mother doing drugs made me squirm, but she said, "Don't worry, Lisa, it was just a different time, era." She said he wasn't terrified of making a fool of himself on drugs, and he made her promise to tell him to snap out of it in case he got weird. That was around the time my father told my mother he'd get famous and rich one day and lose himself in the world. "What do you mean, lose himself?" I asked her. I pictured him confused in the middle of a crowd. "I mean, lose his moral compass," she said. "Trade his character, his soul, for power, for money, for worldly gain. Contort himself, lose the connection to his soul." Beside the house where they lived together over the summer before he left for college was another bungalow with a couple of kids in their 20s from a rich family. They did a lot of drugs and sat around waiting for their parents to die so they could get their inheritance. This left a big impression on both of my parents, how people could waste their lives. Years later, she would tell me this story as a way to explain why my father wouldn't help me with money, repeating the story of those lazy, lost children he'd seen and didn't want me to become. When were your parents divorced?" Other kids would ask me. "They were never married," I said. I like saying it. It was usually a surprise, disarming the questioner. It gave me distinction. Instead of a dad who was around and then left, mine was a story in verse. Parents who spent more time together now than they'd spent when I was born.